All right, and we are live. So, um, yeah, I'm going to be responding to um, this video by Christian Idealism. Well, it's not the person who uploaded the video is Adherent Topologist, not Christian Idealism, but it's mostly going to be me responding to Christian Idealism on the problem of evil. Um, Obviously, the problem of evil is a pretty standard atheological argument, probably the oldest and the most popular atheological argument. Basically, starts with some facts about evil we see in the world, such as specific facts about suffering, or just evil in general. Just the fact that there's uh, evil in the Christian worldview, even like sin and whatnot. Um, and argues that this is inconsistent with the existence of an omniscient, omnipotent, morally perfect being. Um, and obviously, like the oldest known version goes back to Epicurus, um, but there's a lot more modern versions. Like obviously, there's Paul Draper's formulation of the problem of evil, um, which argues from super specific facts about pain and pleasure that they're more expected on um, theism. Sorry, that they're more expected on naturalism, or like what's known as a hypothesis of indifference, than um, sorry, I need to think straight right now. Sorry. So basically, what it argues is that there's uh, given naturalism plus our background information, um, facts about pain and pleasure, serving reproductive roles, reproductive success, um, is something that's going to be expected more on naturalism, right? Because given our background information about natural selection, we know that natural selection selects for traits that are beneficial for reproductive success, right? And pain and pleasure are going to be expected to be no different on that hypothesis. Sorry, I was not thinking straight for 2 seconds there. Anyways, basically, yeah. So naturalism predicts that well. Like it's just a random, unguided process, but we know from like past experience and from scientific background information that natural selection has a tendency to basically pick out traits that are beneficial for reproduction and survival. Whereas on theism, um, if we take it that plausibly pain and pleasure are beneficial, or no, sorry, are moral, have moral value, right? And pain is something that's bad, and pleasure being something that's good. We would expect God, being morally perfect, to perhaps treat pain and pleasure differently. Uh, so that's the basic idea of a. It's more surprising that God's desires happen to align with um, pain and pleasure being beneficial for reproductive success than it is on something like naturalism plus our background experience. That's the Japarian argument, Paul Draper's problem of evil. Obviously, there's more problems of evil, which we might like be able to discuss later. But like without further ado, let's actually start the video.
Hey everyone, welcome back to Adherent Apologetics. Super pumped you're joining us today. Today I have Kyle Allender, also known as Christian Idealism, where we're talking about the problem of evil and how Christians can defeat it. So yeah, Kyle, thanks for joining me. How you doing?
Pretty good. Glad to be here.
I think we have a pretty ambitious target here in this video of defeating the problem of evil. So we're just going to dive right into it. So do you have any like general like considerations you want to talk about when we're looking at the problem of evil?
Yeah, so I guess the first thing is to sort of tell a short story
I'm
of
actually
how I
gonna
got here.
speed this up
I just like
because
I couldn't have gotten
I just want to get through this a little bit faster. It's a 47-minute long video, so
here without other people's help. So Tim Howard is one partner of mine. We're sort of like philosophical partners, and we talk a lot on the phone about these issues. And me and him sort of work through it together. And we had to both sort of read a lot of the philosophical literature on this. I think one of the main reasons, we wanted to take a more, we wanted to be honest with the evidence, right? So the problem of evil is like the biggest objection to theism. Like if you ask any ordinary atheist or agnostic about, why they don't believe God exists or why they think, that God is not all good or something, it's gonna be the problem of evil. Like the problem of evil is like the number one problem for theism, right? It's been around for thousands of years. So, this objection is not necessarily new. What is new, however, is sort of the new formalizations of the argument, right? And so, as I was as me and Tim were researching this, we had to be honest with the evidence because at first my sort of approach prior to this was I took the approach of Clay Jones, and Clay Jones' theodicy is, I think, pretty good for the most part.
So I'm actually not familiar with Clay Jones's approach to the problem of evil. I actually have not read him at all on this, and like based on what I've seen, um, from him on live streams and such. Um, I don't know. The man's just less than impressive to me, but maybe he has some good work on the problem of evil. I'm not exactly familiar. Um, but yeah, I'm just not familiar with his theodicy. So maybe he talks about it here a bit. I can't exactly remember.
when it comes to moral evil, but it's not very good when it comes to like natural evil or any other like evolutionary evils. So I had to like change my perspective, right? And so I had to like, if I wanted to be honest with the evidence, right? If I wanted to, look at the problem of evil in this sort of in the objective way possible, I had to like actually go into the literature and look at all the different versions that exist, right? Early on, I started off with this. Now these aren't just problem of evil arguments; there's also other arguments, but
Okay, so hold on. Let me actually get a good look at that book. I think I recognize that book.
versions that exist, right? Early on, I started off with this.
So I'm not sure if that says the impossibility of God or the improbability of God, because I know that there are two anthology sort of books that have a collection of works on like basically um, arguments against theism. And I've read the impossibility of God, but I have not read the improbability of God. Um, there's actually a lot of good stuff in the impossibility of God that I checked out. Like, for example, you have Richard R. Lacroix. I think it's how you pronounce his name. I think he's French, so Richard R. Lacroix. He has his own version of a problem of evil. It's like a logical problem of evil, which argues that since God is the greatest possible good, um, any evil that obtains in creation um, that entails greater goods are going to entail, by definition, lesser goods than the greatest possible good. So, since the state of God existing alone is the greatest possible good and entails no evil, right? Because God entails no evil. That we, like theists even believe this. Like they believe in like prior purity. Um, what God would have to do in order to create the world was he'd have to transition the world into a state of perfection to a state with perfection plus some evil, which just seems incompatible with perfection. So that's obviously, um, I think that's a much more stronger approach to the problem of evil than J.L. Mackie and his logical problem of evil, which um, I basically that's the version of the problem of evil that's like the earliest one introduced into contemporary analytic philosophy of religion, and it doesn't really work out so well because basically there's like the difficulty of trying to get the theist to commit to a set of claims that are commitments of theism, um, which jointly entail a contradiction, and Mackie doesn't succeed in doing that as Plantinga showed. I don't think like Plantinga's free will defense is that good, but I think that he at least successfully shows that Mackie fails to derive a contradiction from theism. But I think that Richard R. Lacroix's attempt to like derive a contradiction from premises that are plausibly commitments of theism, I think that that his attempt is way better. And his I think his paper is called "Unjustified Evil and God's Choice." So that I'm sorry, I've been like talking about that specific argument for a bit, but yeah, that's one approach to a logical problem of evil that I take, and that's in Michael Martin's book, The Impossibility of God. But I don't think that that's the impossibility of God. It kind of looks like improbability of God to me, and I actually have not read that book yet because it's basically impossible to find a PDF of that book, as far as I can tell.
Now, these aren't just problem evil arguments, there's also other arguments, but mostly problem evil stuff, right? So most of the arguments in here are going to be problem evil arguments. And then, of course, you have J.L. Mackie, which I read this probably twice now, and he presents his logical, the logical version of problem evil. So I had to, when I first started off, my sort of view was that that evil is evidence against God, that evil at least has some weight, or at least that my general sort of view that I took was, okay, evil is evidence against theism, right? And that I just thought that the evidence for theism would sort of outweigh it, right? So I took this sort of outweigh approach. It's like, okay, even if evil is like evidence against theism, it's not strong enough to like outweigh sort of the probability, right? That started to change, however, when I started reading, like, there was this one paper by Robert Bass, it's called Inscrutable Evils, and he uses
So yeah, basically, what he's talking about is that evil. He's basically like his first approach was that he admits evil is enough to provide evidence against theism, but it's not enough to show that theism is positively irrational, given all the evidence taken into consideration, basically, right? And I think that that's probably one of the best approaches to the problem of evil. Even in Rowe's original paper on the problem of evil, and some varieties of atheism, I think it's called. Obviously, William Rowe being one of the, if not, I think the earliest proprietor of the evidential formulations of the problem of evil. Yeah, so basically, like he outlined this kind of response in his original paper, where basically what the theist can do is like a Moorian shift. basically the atheist wants to argue there are evils in the world such that an omnipotent, omniscient being can prevent them without without preventing the possibility of an equally great or equal or greater good, or preventing or permitting an equal or worse evil. Um, and obviously, if God exists, then there is no such evils such as that in the world. And together, those premises jointly entail that God does not exist. What the theist is going to want to do is they're going to want to take they're going to want to take a one person's modus ponens as another person's modus tollens approach, and argue God exists, and if God exists, then there is no evil in the world such that an omnipotent, omniscient being can prevent it without preventing an equal or great good or permitting an equal or worse evil. Therefore, there is no evil such that an omnipotent, omniscient being can prevent it without permitting an equal or worse good, or equal or great good, or permitting an equal or worse evil. So that's basically the Morean strategy to the problem of evil. I don't know if he's like taking that exact approach, but basically something similar to that the evidence for theism is outweighing. And I think that that's probably the most promising approach to the problem of evil, because I think that obviously my position is that pretty much all the responses to the problem of evil are either widely implausible in terms of like our ethical commitments and ethical intuitions, or they're just they run afoul of issues regarding like skeptical worries or divine psychology. I think that all pretty much like based on like my survey of the literature and my talking with a bunch of people about the argument, I don't think that there's an out of the problem of evil without incurring some at least significant theoretical and evidential damage. Obviously, he disagrees, but let's move forward.
Agent calculation. Now, just to be clear, even before this, I didn't necessarily agree with the way he did the probabilities, but basically his argument was that even if you gave theism a 99% probability or prior probability, that evil would still outweigh theism. So then basically evil, at least inscrutable evils, are sort of like the amount of inscrutable evils would be enough to sort of tip against theism, right? Now, of course, again, I don't, even before this, even before I came to the conclusion I do now, I didn't necessarily buy his argument because I didn't really agree with the way that he did the probabilities, but I could sort of understand, like, okay, you know, an atheist, I could see why, okay, as an atheist, you could sort of conclude, even if you have all this evidence for theism.
I think I've actually read that paper on the problem of inscrutable evils, and I think that there's like an interesting strategy you can do there to when combining his approach with Michael Tooley's approach. That uses something similar to the principle of indifference. So basically, we'd argue, even if we assume something like skeptical theism, where like we can't be justified in believing that some instance of inscrutable evil entails some greater good, we can still we can say that there's no a priori reason to think that the possibility of there being a greater good that outweighs the evil in question, which entails the evil in question, is more likely than the possibility of there being a greater evil that entails the evil in question, that makes the evil actually worse than it is, all things considered. Michael Tooley prefers to use, and I actually agree with him on this, he prefers to use deontological terms rather than axiological terms such as good and evil. So deontological terms being right and wrong, and axiological terms being good and evil, right? So basically, the way he'd frame it is that there are four possibilities in terms of like an evil, and one possibility is that there are unknown right-making properties which outweigh all the known wrong-making properties, known and unknown. That's one possibility. And there's another possibility, which is that there is an unknown wrong-making property which makes the evil in question actually worse than it is, all things considered. And then there's the third possibility where there are unknown right-making and wrong-making properties, but they're just outweighing. They just cancel each other out, and the evilness of the evil in question is exactly as evil as it appears to be, like at first glance, prima facie, right? And then there's the final possibility, which is that, of course, that there's no unknown wrong-making or unknown right-making properties at all. Meaning, once again, the evil is just as evil as it seems, right? Based on known wrong-making properties, it's just going to be like, evil as it seems to us. So, basic idea is that if there's no justification for accepting one of these possibilities over any other, then we're justified in it. Basically, we would assign a 1 in 4 chance to a given evil being all things considered evil, given inscrutable evil being all things considered evil. And so when we look at like a vast array, when we look out in the world and we see that there's plausibly thousands upon thousands upon thousands upon millions upon millions upon millions, even prior to the existence of humanity itself, instances of what seem to be prima facie evils. And keep in mind, for each one, we're gonna assign a 1 in 4 chance that it's all things considered justified, then it's gonna like the likelihood's not gonna look very good for theism. Is basically what the approach is gonna entail. So I know I've been talking about this like quite a bit, but like um, but I think that basically outlines. I already outlined two approaches to the problem of evil. There's the Draper approach, and then there's the Michael Tooley approach, and I outlined both. Meanwhile, we're only 4 minutes into the video, so let's get continuing with this. Shall we?
Evil just sort of outweighs it, right? So I had to be honest, right? I had to like look into the data, look into the literature. Okay, what are these philosophers saying? What are these atheist philosophers saying? And then also, what are the responses, right, from the theistic side, right? So me and Tim, we had to like go through a lot of stuff, and there's different approaches, right? So there's Clay Jones' approach, which is a sort of Augustine theodicy. Then there's also a skeptical theist theodicy, or not theodicy, but skeptical theism is the idea that we can't really.
Yeah, I was gonna say skeptical theism isn't really a theodicy per se.
Right. So, and then there's also other sort of approaches like the Molinist. I know William Lane Craig has done some work on the problem of evil. So there's a lot of views on this, right? There's different approaches. So we had to like be careful in how we would approach it, right? And see what is the best approach for a theist to take, right? And we want to make sure. I think most importantly is we want to make sure that whatever answer we come up with, that it would sort of make sure that if we had to present a theodicy, then it had to be good enough so that it would not like decrease the probability of the hypothesis. So basically, you don't want to like build stuff in, right? And I feel like what Clay Jones's stuff did is I think that he has to build in a lot of stuff. So he has to build in a fall, he has to build in sort of Christian story. I think those are very problematic, right? And so I had to look elsewhere for a sort of answer, right? And the answer that I came to was, well, I was quite surprised. Me and Tim were quite surprised when we reached this conclusion, but basically the problem doesn't work at all. So it doesn't have any sort of evidence weight at all. Now I know.
Yeah, that is a pretty radical position. Even among theists, actually, some theists most theists actually will admit that the problem of evil has some force against them. I've seen like a lot of live streams where like Joe Schmid would go into a channel, or someone else would go into a channel, and they'd say that the problem of evil is like the one argument that just keeps their eyes open at night. So like there's this intuition even among theists that there's some force to the problem of evil. Now he takes the extreme position where like the problem of evil has no force whatsoever, and this is going to be actually interesting because I actually take the opposite position. I actually think that the problem of evil has like more. I'd say that I put more stock in the problem of evil than most theologians, because I think that the problem of evil, even on its own, pretty much decisively refutes theism. It provides like even the evidential formulations. Such as if you want to take like a collective approach using Michael Tooley's and Paul Draper's, or like mix them up a bit. I think an evidential approach makes theism extremely improbable. And I also think that there's some logical problems of evil, such as the ones that are recently defended by J.L. Schellenberg and Quentin Smith, and I think J.L. Sobel has a defensive one in his Logic and Theism book, which is widely considered to be one of the best philosophy of religion books of all time. So I do think that there's successful logical problems of evil too, which would show that the existence of evil or imperfection or what have you in the world are logically inconsistent with the existence of God. And obviously, a priori arguments would entail with near certainty that God does not exist. And so basically, my position is that I think that the problem of evil is just pretty much just devastating for theism. Like I don't think that theism can recover from it. So my position is pretty much the opposite extreme, like just the antithesis of this position. But I have an open mind. Let's see what he can say.
That is an extreme position. So I know that most apologists, at least that I've seen, they sort of grant problem, so they'll say, that it can work in some sense, right? But that, the evidence for theism sort of outweighs it. My approach, at least my conclusion on this, is that the problem doesn't work at all. So it doesn't even have any evidential weight at all, right? And there's a few, I give, 4 main reasons why we'll get into those, but there are reasons why I think that. And, hopefully today I can sort of present those reasons. So yeah, I guess that's the general story. Basically, we started off with, a fall theodicy, then we worked through the literature, and then finally we came to a point where basically it's not a problem anymore. And my conclusion now is, of course, that I don't think the problem works at all, like not even in an evidential sense. So the evidential probability is just 0 at that point. I know that, again, that's an extreme position, but I had to be honest with what I was looking at, and so that's what I came to.
Yeah, it's super helpful. And I think that when we get through your points, Kyle, it does seem kind of like a very ambitious claim to say like problem evil just like doesn't work. It's a bad argument. But to do that, like really, it's important to get into like your 4 big reasons that we'll get into a minute. Because I think it's gonna really help people listening and seeing this to kind of understand where we're coming from. Because obviously, I know like all my like amazing like atheistic Gnostic friends that listen to be like, what the heck are they talking about?
Yeah.
But we're gonna dive into it. So anything else you want to say before we dive into these 4 major problems?
I guess there are 2 general considerations that I want to point out here. And these are sort of what I came to when I was doing my research. So the first, I guess maybe only one general consideration, which is that we have to understand what theism actually is as a hypothesis, right? So we have to understand that theism, because it's a metaphysical hypothesis, then we should only be concerned with like fundamental facts about the world, right? And so one of those fundamental facts, at least when it comes to power of evil, is going to be, why does God allow bad states of affairs to occur, right? It's not about, okay, well, why does God allow, hurricanes? Why does God allow pain and pleasure and evolution? Why does God, like, those are sort of macro level phenomena of the more deeper question in my mind, which is, why do bad states of affairs occur, right? Because those are all bad states of affairs, right? And so, given the type of hypothesis that theism is, then the only concern.
So there's actually already some difficulty I have with how he's framing this. Why would God allow bad state of affairs? I don't think that that's necessarily how I would frame the issue, right? Because bad is sort of like an axiological term, whereas if we want to actually like make predictions about what God would do, like we want to use deontological terms, right? Because if something is wrong to do, all things considered, then God wouldn't do that, just in virtue of his moral perfection. God can't do anything wrong. All of God's actions have this property of rightness, right? So God can't do anything wrong. So if we use deontological terms and say that this state of affairs is all things considered wrong to permit, rather than just saying, oh, it's bad, then I think we avoid a lot of the issues of I mean, God would allow bad states of affairs to occur. I mean, like we would allow that. We would basically like sidestep that completely, because no, this state of affairs is wrong to permit, right? It would be immoral if someone were to permit it. And like when we frame it like that, then there's no out for the theist there. Like if it's immoral to permit, then God can't permit it, right? That's just what it means to be immoral, right? And all of God's actions and what the morally best action is, or at least what's morally right, are going to be in perfect harmony, right? There's nothing that God does that's going to be morally wrong.
The question that a theist needs to answer, right, with power of evil, is, why does God allow bad states of affairs to occur, and why are there like bad properties, right? So why does God allow the badness of properties to take into a hold? So I think that question sort of covers everything, right? So it covers the biological world of pain and pleasure. It covers burning fawn. It covers like any sort of evil you can possibly sort of imagine is going to sort of include that general question, right? So I think if theism can answer that question, why does God allow bad states of affairs to occur, then the power of evil just gets nullified, right? It's not a problem anymore, and it doesn't matter like what version of power of evil you come up with, right? So that was sort of earlier in my journey before I came to my conclusion. That was
no, that's not true. If the theist can, sorry, I don't think I quite caught what he said, but let me actually like repeat that.
The power of evil just gets nullified, right? It's not a problem. Pain and pleasure. It covers burning fawn. It covers like any sort of evil you can possibly sort of imagine is going to sort of include that general question, right? So I think if theism can answer that question, why does God allow bad states of affairs to occur, then the power of evil just gets nullified, right? It's not a problem anymore.
No, not true at all. So yeah, like you could like the idea is, yes, the theist can have an explanation for why God would allow bad states of affairs, or there can be like some story you can tell that makes it the case that theism is consistent with the hypothesis. That's fine, but I mean, at least that's fine if you want to take an evidential approach. But the idea is theism a better explanation for the evil we see in the world? Is it more predicting of the evil we see in the world than naturalism or the hypothesis of indifference? And I know, and that's going to be like what the atheists are going to want to say. They're going to want to say that theism doesn't better predict what we see in the world. Like, sure, you like anyone could invent some story that makes their position basically explain facts in the world, even in like an ad hoc way or what have you, right? But the idea is, if like their position, whether their position is going to have like theoretical virtues, right? Whether it's going to be simpler, whether it explains the facts in like a non-ad hoc way, right? You see the facts and you didn't construct a hypothesis afterwards, right? It's just, it predicts the facts. Like it makes like novel predictions. That's a virtue. I'm not saying that's a necessary condition for a theory, but that's going to be like a virtue of a theory, right? It's testable, it's informative, it doesn't undermine divine psychology such that, all states of affairs are going to be consistent with it, right? And the idea is you can't just kill the problem of evil just by inventing some story such that theism can be consistent with the evil we see in the world. Right, like you could still incur significant theoretical disadvantages, and you could still, it could still be shown that theism is just going to be a straightforwardly just a worse explanation for these facts, just a bad explanation. So, I think that what he said there is just incorrect.
And it doesn't matter like what version of power of evil you come up with, right? So that was sort of earlier in my journey before I came to my conclusion. That was that was one of my first sort of principles. Was like, okay, yes, there are different versions of the problem of evil, but fundamentally they're all sort of linked back to this ultimate question, which is why does God allow bad states of affairs to occur, right? Because I mean, it doesn't matter which version you come up with, right? Even all the versions that exist today, and even any versions that happen, that people that philosophers write about in the future, is all going to come down to this fundamental question, right?
Yeah.
So me and Tim, we sort of focused mainly on that question, right? So it didn't really matter if there were certain evils like, let's say, parasites, or there's another example which is there's teleological evils, right? So teleological evils is another example where it's like you have species that sort of their existence is to give pain to other species, right? But even in that circumstance, that's still going to boil down to that fundamental question, right? So that's just the first. That's really the only general consideration I want to people to keep in mind here, that when it comes to any version of probable evil, it's going to really come down to that question, right? So now let's get into my 4 sort of points on the probable evil. So the first one is what I call the problem of shared axiology, right? So what does this mean? Well, I went over this in my debate, but I guess just briefly summarizing here. So in order for the probable evil to get off the ground, it has to assume an axiology, right? So it's going to have to assume a more fundamental value theory, or what I call value assumptions, or a set of value assumptions.
All right, so I already disagree with what he's saying. He's saying basically that the atheist has to invent their own value theory in order to attack the problem of evil. It has to work from the assumption of some sort of axiological theory. When it's not clear to me that that's the case at all. It seems to me that even if we want to frame the problem of evil with axiology in the first place, which again is controversial. Like, again, as I pointed out, Michael Tooley wants to frame the problem of evil with deontological terminology rather than axiological terminology. In fact, I'm actually kind of partial to that approach as well, because I think that framing the problem of evil with axiological terminology often leads to sort of consequentialist reasoning that I'm not a huge fan of as a deontologist. So basically, I basically, like, first of all, like, it's not clear that we would even be like framing this with axiological terms at all. And second of all, like, it seems to me that we can just run the problem of evil as an internal critique. It doesn't seem to me that the atheist needs their own axiological theory. But let's get to his point.
Right. I mean, I think this is pretty obvious. I mean, if you're gonna say, okay, there's this bad states of affairs that God would not allow, well, you're gonna have to assume an axiology there. You're gonna have to assume that these actually are bad states of affairs in the first place, right? And so, in order for the problem of evil to actually get off the ground, you're gonna have to assume a value theory. You have to assume that there is this sort of set of values that God is constrained by, and if God, if God violates those,
well, you can say that there's a set of values that, in accordance with the Christian worldview, or accordance with God's standards, or what have you, are bad. And this is and basically in accordance with God's own objective standards. God is out of accord with them. He's violating his own objective standards. So basically, that's one way to frame the problem of evil. So I just don't accept that the theist needs to assume their own axiological theory. It could just be an internal critique. And I also don't accept that we should even be framing this in terms of values or axiology in the first place. I think we should be framing this in terms of what actions are permissible or impermissible to do.
Sets then that sort of false theism, right? Because on theism, God can only do good things, right? That's the whole idea. God is all good; He can only do good things. Therefore, given a certain value theory, God can only do what is according to the value theory, right?
Yeah.
But the problem here is that there are a plurality of different value theories, right? There's virtue ethics, there's utilitarianism, there's consequentialism, right? There's deontology. Now, this doesn't necessarily mean that the probably won't work.
It's not clear to me that that those are going to be theories of value. I guess virtue ethics kind of is a theory of value, but like, it seems to me that most deontological theories and most utilitarian theories are theories of moral reasons and the properties of actions, right? They're not theories of value per se, anyways.
Work. It just pointed out here that if God is constrained by, let's say, virtue ethics, right, where God is sort of motivated to sort of produce virtues, right, and if virtues require certain suffering, then it just logically follows that God's going to have to, according to the value theory, going to have to allow for a certain amount of suffering to occur, right?
Yeah.
And I think another consideration here, I'll get more into this.
Yeah, I mean, like, if you want to subscribe to, like, again, if you want to again, we're talking about, like, not really value theory. We're talking about, like, what actions would be permissible to do. So what you want to say is that it'd be permissible for God to permit suffering in order to allow, like, virtues to obtain. So obviously, as a deontologist, I don't think that that's really plausible at all, because because first of all, it seems to me that God would be using agents as a mere means to an end, in order to achieve greater goods. And second of all, even if we, like, don't even suppose my particular value theory is what he wants to call it, it's more of a theory of moral reasons or moral actions, right? Not really a value theory, but even if we want to assume my value, even if we weren't to assume my value theory, it's not clear that even on virtue ethics it would be permissible. I mean, it seems to me that there's like a million ways in order like to achieve virtues without suffering. Just imagine sympathy, right? Um, Standard example is there needs to be some suffering that you can respond to in order to have sympathy, right? But there's a point to be made here that that's not necessarily the case. I mean, just imagine garnering sympathy through fictional reading fictional works, right? Just imagine like you reading a story and um, having fictional instances of suffering, like suffering that isn't actually exemplified in the world, but rather are instantiated in this world of fiction, right, created by some author. Um, you can imagine a world where people read works of art like that and have sympathy for the characters in the story, um, whereas no actual suffering is exemplified in the world. So it seems to me that that's the best of both worlds. Um, and I don't even think like virtue ethics would say that. It doesn't seem like basically like virtue ethics would say that that they'd be like they a big part of virtue ethics is they'd say that there's like um, intentionality about like what's right to do, right? Um, and it's not clear like whereas it might be like all things considered good for there to be virtues in the world on the virtue ethics theory, virtue ethicist theory. Doesn't seem to me that that means that God would be permitted to allow that, right? Because it's not exactly sympathetic of God to um, sit back and watch suffering so some other people can be sympathetic and respond with sympathy, right? It's not exactly courageous of God to allow soldiers um, to suffer horrifically in battle, lose families, um, so they can build courage. It's not God that's being courageous there. It doesn't seem to me to follow, right? Intuitively, if if someone had the ability to prevent all these evils, all this suffering, um, without any risk to themselves, we would think that that's a good thing. That's a good action that should be done, and we would think that if someone didn't do that, despite having the power to do it, that would be a bad action. It wouldn't be virtuous, even on the virtue ethicist own theory. So what the virtue ethicist wanting to say is they basically want to say that good actions are determined by disposition towards certain virtues, intentionality towards certain virtues. That's my understanding of their position, at least. And it doesn't seem to me that it's virtuous of God to, like, sure, in terms of axiology, there's like you can say that there's more axiology and more goodness in the world, but on the virtue ethicist's deontological theory, the theory of rightness and wrongness. I know it sounds like a contradiction, the virtue ethicist's deontological theory, um, but basically on the theory of rightness and wrongness, would it be right for God to allow infants to suffer so someone else can build virtues? It's not clear to me that that's going to be virtuous on the virtue ethicist theory, right? It certainly isn't virtuous on deontology. Well, it certainly isn't morally right on deontology. And there might be like a utilitarian approach here, like maybe God, there's like some pleasure that is entailed by God allowing an infant to be tortured. But most people aren't a fan of like this strict hedonic utilitarianism. And even if we are to assume utilitarianism, I mean, we can still take. There's like several approaches we can take. It doesn't seem likely that pain and pleasure being linked with reproductive success. It'd be surprising if pain and pleasure being linked with reproductive success is actually like the best means God has to achieve the most amount of pleasure in the world. That would be. I mean, it's not surprising on naturalism that we have this, but it'd be surprising on utilitarianism plus theism plus our background information that God would allow pain and pleasure to basically function as roles for reproductive success, just as any other role or function biological organisms exhibit. Like that would be extremely surprising on theism plus utilitarianism. So there's like a million approaches, even with utilitarianism, that we can approach. So it doesn't. So actually, on all three value theories, there's an approach we can take here, right? So it's not clear to me that there is an out for the theist in this regard, even if we assume that we have to assume our own like value theory and we aren't just doing an internal critique, or even if we assume that we're talking about axiology instead of deontology. It's not clear that there actually even is an out for the theist here. But the upshot is I'd say that we should frame it in terms of deontology, right? So let's continue.
when I get into the next point, which is the defeat condition. But the whole idea is you want to, that sort of lays out the game, right? Because it's like, okay, well, if you're going to come up with an argument from evil, you're going to say, well, God would create a world that is perfect, right? This is the imperfection argument. Since we live in an imperfect world, and therefore God would not do that, right? And the issue that I see there is that you're going to have to make a lot of assumptions about what is perfect and what's not perfect, right? And you're also going to make a lot of assumptions about what type of world are we actually judging here when it comes to what's perfect and what's not perfect, right?
Okay, I'll let him continue, but like, let's see where he goes with this.
And this gets into the problem of what I call incrementability, right? And this basic idea is that there are certain values in our world that you can't really compare to, like, I don't know, the value of like an angelic world or something, right? So you're gonna have this incrementability going on. So it's not like there's this universal set of like, okay, these are like the best values that could occur in any possible state of affairs, and then you have these lower levels. Like, no, I think there are sort of like, they're incrementable. Like, you can't really measure them, so to speak.
Yeah.
Right? And I think so. Given that sort of problem, then and this, I think this is relevant to the shared axiology, because the axiology is also going to sort of have this incrementability issue, right? And there's a paper by I forgot his name. I think it's Rubio something, but he talks about how any world that God creates, there could always be a better world, right? And a better world and a better world. And it's like, okay, well, you're gonna run into this paradox where God just can't create any world, because any world that God creates, God can just create a better one, right? So in that case, given this sort of axiology there, then there's gonna be a circumstance by which, because God cannot create the perfect world, because that's just metaphysically impossible, then there's gonna be sort of the next best state of actions that God can do is gonna be an imperfect world, right?
Yeah.
Now, me and Tim, I know in our last rebuttal to Ben Watkins, we sort of pointed this out. And the basic idea here is that there's going to be, because of that incrementability problem, given this sort of hierarchy of, God could just always create the next best world, then you run into this issue where either God creates no world or God creates an imperfect world. And what I mean by imperfect world is that, just to be clear here, that imperfect world, when I mean that, is that it's incrementable. So while it is true that God can only create the best world, that best world is going to be incrementable to some other best world, right? In terms of value, right? Because you can't really measure them, right? And so because of that leads a lot of problems, because I see what a lot of arguments from evil they sort of do is they sort of assume one set of incrementable values, but then they have to ignore this other set of incrementable values that God may be more obligated or more motivated to act by, right? So I hope that helps in terms of.
Okay, so yeah, I'm not convinced by this response, this best of all possible worlds response, and there's a bunch of reasons why. For one, if God would create the best possible world, and like we assume that there's this infinite hierarchy of best possible worlds, so there isn't the best possible world, then, and the theist wants to use this to their advantage. They want to say, well, I mean, that just means that God wouldn't create the best possible world, so God can't be judged for creating less than the best possible world. Well, we'd be moving too fast here, because like, even though God didn't create the best possible world, there's a world better than this world that God could have created, like the next better world, and then there's the question of why didn't God create that world. We're not asking why God didn't create the best possible world, and we're going to grant that that's possible. It's impossible that God could create the best possible world. Well, then it just follows that for any world God could create, there's a better world that some other being could have created, such that they would be morally better. And so all that would follow is that no being can have actions such that they're going to be morally perfect. And there's a couple of papers on this, one by Klaas Cray, there's one by William Rowe. I know the Howard Schneider's, I can't remember which Howard Schneider it was, but he has like an approach to this where he tries to argue against the best of all possible worlds argument. I don't think he succeeds, but I think I'm going to link those papers in the description. And another approach here is that even though God wouldn't create the best possible world, like we can even grant their assumption here, there's no best of all possible worlds, so God wouldn't create the best possible world. It's still not going to be obvious that God wouldn't create a perfect world, right? Because the perfect world doesn't mean a best of all possible worlds. It just means a world that has no flaws. You can imagine worlds that have higher and lower degrees of perfection, right? And it seems to me that a perfect world is going to be a world that contains God alone, right? God being the greatest possible good, contains no evil, no flaws, has complete prior purity, right? And his existence alone doesn't entail any evil. So it seems like what we'd expect from God is that he wouldn't create anything, right? Because any creation that obtains, any evil that obtains, assuming that the evils are entailed by some greater good, or the greater goods are entailed by the evils in question, is what I should say. Right, the greater goods entail evil. Even if we grant that, those greater goods are just going to be lesser goods. They're not anything compared to God, the greatest possible good. And on some axiological theories, on some of the most popular axiological theories, that theists use, those goods are only going to be good in virtue of resemblance to God anyway. So they're not good in themselves; they're good in virtue of resembling to God. Well, I guess you could still say that they're good in themselves, but they're good in themselves to the extent that they resemble God's nature or that they resemble God's purpose, his telos, right? So, and if you take that approach, it's certainly not going to be obvious that the addition of any created worldly goods are going to be better, all things considered, um, than just a world where God exists alone. And it seems to me that then any evil that his creation produces is just going to be pointless, right? They're not necessary for any greater good that the evils would entail, even if we assume that all these evils entail a greater good, which is already a generous assumption from the get-go, because it doesn't seem like we have any reason to believe that over the hypothesis that they don't produce any greater goods or that they produce actually even greater evils. So even if we were to grant that, it seems like we just have this logical problem here where for a greater good they entail, we know, given the theist's own commitments, that God, being the greatest possible good, surpasses any greater good that these evils can entail. So why wouldn't God just actualize a world where the greatest possible good exists sans any evils? Since we know God alone doesn't entail any evils, he didn't have to create the world, unless you want to restrict his omnipotence or his freedom in some way, which will, of course, lead to more theoretical issues for the theist. So I think that this is a big problem for the theist. And I don't think that his response here, like with regards to the best of all possible worlds approach, the incommensurability of values approach, I don't think that this really deals with all these theoretical costs.
Of the axiology.
Mhm.
And then I guess, well, my next point will probably be more relevant to this. But yeah, so I hope that makes sense. Do you have any like questions or
Yeah.
concerns?
So how similar should it be? Obviously, like one very common response to the problem of evil is the idea that like, well, you can't have evil without good, and you can't have good without God. Like, is this your any like similarity to that kind of argument, or do you feel like a very different kind of like response to the problem of evil?
Well, in this sense, it's sort of pointing out that the problem of evil has to assume a sort of incremental value set, right? So what does that mean? Well, it means that in order to say, okay, well, God can only create the best world or perfect world or whatever, okay, best according to what? Right? Like, what's the value set that you're using to judge this, right?
Okay.
And the problem is, given a certain value set, then there might be a case.
But the problem is, given the theist's own commitments, God is the best possible good. He's the greatest possible being, qua good itself, right? Even classical theists will say that God is the good itself. And even if you're a theistic personalist, then you're just going to say that God exemplifies a set of properties that are just the maximal, they're just maximal goodness qua being, like maximal goodness. There's nothing in creation that could possibly surpass God's goodness. He is the greatest possible good that could exist, right? And so any evil that creation entails, or that is entailed by the evils in question, or the greater goods that entail the evils in question, I should say, those are just going to be lesser goods, right? They're not going to add goodness to the world where God exists alone. And so those evils are just unnecessary for obtaining greater goods, right? For any greater good that is entailed by an evil, there's a greater good that isn't entailed by the evil. God himself, right? God is the greatest possible good, and he doesn't entail any evil. So it's unclear why God would make creation at all, right? It seems to me that in order for God to create creation, the world itself would have to transition from a state of absolute perfection where nothing but the greatest possible good exists. So just basically the best world, just a completely a perfect world that's missing no great making properties, no perfections, to a state where to a state that contains some imperfections, some evils, right? And at the very least, it seems prima facie that this poses a problem or a threat for theism.
And I think this is the case where
It's not clear why God would do that at all. Why would you transition the world from a state of perfection to a state of less than that, to a state that contains evils, right?
not going to have a world that's perfect because there can always just be a best world, a better world relative to that, right? So in that sense, it's incommensurable, right? You have this incommensurability problem, right? Which is going to really, I think, that's going to at least.
So yeah, a better world, a world better than that. So again, there's two responses. One, if there's no best of all possible worlds, then we're assuming that God would want to maximize the best possible worlds, which seems intuitive. Then so much the worse for theism, right? Because for any world God would create, well, we can imagine a greater conceivable being that would actualize a world that's greater than the world that he created. And so it's just going to be impossible for God to exist, right? At least God qua moral perfection. And we cannot conceive of a being whose actions are greater, right? And it seems intuitive that creating the best possible world, that's going to be something that some sort of measuring stick for the greatness of beings, at least part of it, right? But even if we don't use this whole idea of the best possible worlds thing, seems to me that there's no reason why God would create a world at all, rather than just I don't know, eternally reflect on His own perfection, right? It seems to me that there's no good reason for God to do that at all, right? At the very least, even if we don't want to say this opposes an insurmountable a priori objection to theism, at the very least, it seems just arbitrary for God to create a world rather than just a state where God exists alone, right?
Sort of nullify the problem, because any argument for evil is going to have to sort of have that in the background assumption. But given this problem of shared axiology, given the incommensurability issues and stuff, then you're automatically, that sort of stops the problem of evil from really having any sort of force, if that makes sense.
Okay, yeah, I think that's great. So thank you.
So I disagree with this response being a good one at all. But yeah, let's move on to the next point.
Maybe then let's dive into number 2, which is the idea that God is a unique moral agent.
Yeah, so this one was this objection that me and Tim sort of came up with is a little bit different than the Brian Davies view. So it is similar in many respects, but it's also different. So there's a book by Brian Davies, I think it's called I can't remember God and the Problem of Evil. I can't remember the exact title because I didn't like it too well. It was not like I can agree with some of the motivations behind his arguments, but I was very like, I was like, okay, this is not doing too well. But so what Brian Davies is gonna say is that that God is not a moral agent at all, right? So God, God is all good, right? But then God doesn't really have any obligations whatsoever, right? That's an extreme position, right? And I can sort of understand the classical theist intuition behind that, but what me and Tim have come up with is sort of a middle ground approach where, instead of saying that God has no obligations, right? That's one extreme, Brian Davies. The other extreme would be that that God is a human moral agent, right? That God is sort of restrained by these ethical human moral conditions, right?
Okay,
and so the middle part, a good middle ground between those extremes is, I think, the one that me and Tim hold to, which is a sort of that God is a unique moral agent, which means that basically that God has unique moral obligations that only apply to him and nobody else. Now, why is this relevant to the problem of evil? Well, there's a few reasons. So number one is that a lot of arguments from
that's an interesting position. I've actually heard of the position of God not being like a moral agent, not having moral obligations. I've actually heard that before. Of course, that's a horrifying thought, right? Imagine it doesn't seem plausible at all, right? Like if we assume that God's like a rational being, and what about him? What feature about him would make it the case that he doesn't have the same, he doesn't have moral obligations at all, right? And I know that there's multiple approaches to this. There's a paper that I've seen about God's goodness not being predicative of himself, right? Which goes into the classical theist view. But man, like that stuff is just, I get lost in that really quickly. I don't think that such a position can ultimately be made sense of. But I think this approach seems different. That he is a moral agent, but he's sort of a unique moral agent. And this actually reminds me of a few conversations I've had actually. For example, if you want to run like a sort of Kantian approach to the problem of evil, and you want to say that God, in virtue of being like a rational agent, has obligations to other rational agents, such that like his rational autonomy, he must affirm his rational autonomy as the source of normativity and the reason for all of his actions, so that if he violates other beings' rational autonomy, he would just be being inconsistent, right? He would just be being inconsistent with his own goals, or the sort of values that source of normativity that makes his goals intelligible in the first place. So God would be irrational for using his creatures as mere means to an end. But then what the theist's reply to that would be is that God is a wholly other kind of moral agent, such that it would be totally irrational for God to affirm his autonomy and not the autonomy of lowly creatures such as humans, right? Personally, I don't think that such a response is that convincing, but then again, I wouldn't probably run the sort of Kantian argument anyways, because it seems like a bit of an uphill battle. But I don't find this response convincing because I think that the Kantian view is that rational agency as such is valuable and is such that it can't be violated as such, right? And it doesn't matter what kind of rational agent are you. It's your rational. It's just in virtue of being a rational agent as such, that is the source of normativity that constitutes these features of your agency in the first place, right? And that's how the Kantian wants to derive the absurdity or the irrationality from using rational agents as mere means to an end. So I don't find that response compelling. Though of course, I wouldn't use this argument in the first place because I think it's a it's a long fight and relies on a lot of controversial assumptions.
From evil sort of assume that God is a unique or that God is a human moral agent, right? So like one example is like, okay, let's say that like someone's getting murdered.
So I don't think the argument assumes that God is a human moral agent, right? At best, you might be able to say that God is relevantly similar to human moral agents, such that his obligations wouldn't be like relevantly different in a way that avoids the problem of evil. I guess like you want to say something adjacent to that, but I don't think the argument at any point assumes that God's like a human moral agent.
Right? It's like, oh well, wouldn't you want to stop that murder, right? And so because God didn't stop that murder, then therefore, God can't be all good. Well, that argument, that argument actually assumes that God is a human moral agent, right? And the problem is that there's no really good reason for that. So that's an undefended assumption that God is a human moral agent. There is one exception though. The only time that I've seen it defended, the only time that I've seen.
I don't think that's an assumption at all. Like, it could be granted that God shares some features to situations that human beings like can't share in virtue of their limited properties, right? That seems like wholly plausible to me, actually. But like what the idea would be is humans being more powerful and more knowledgeable. It doesn't make it the case. Like nothing about that lessens their obligations to not rape infants, for example, right? We wouldn't say that a human being, this human being's omnipotent, right? I guess he has. I guess it's permissible for him to, rape babies now, right? No, that'd still be immoral, right? This being is like fully knowledgeable, but he's like a Machiavellian sort of evil super genius, right? He wants to like create a doomsday device to end civilization, right? No, we would say that being is immoral, and right. So when we reflect on our moral intuitions and when we start to like add God's properties to human beings, it doesn't seem to me that there's anything about God's properties, or if you don't want to assume like God's properties, there's nothing about God himself. That seems to me, if we applied it to humans, would lessen our obligations, right? So that's going to be a sort of intuition pump there. So it doesn't seem to me that this idea of making God like or claiming God is like this unique moral agent. Sure, there can be some unknown goods beyond our understanding, such that God has shares this understanding of the situation or these features of the situation that human beings, just in virtue of our limited capacities, couldn't possibly possess, right? That's plausible, and in that sense, God's obligations would be different. I don't think that's controversial at all, right? But just the idea that like, I guess God like being a unique being, I guess God being more powerful or something, like whatever you want to say, like whatever you want to say, like it's not clear to me that there's something there, at least like on my moral intuitions and the intuitions of most morally sensible people or morally sensitive people, that there's something there that makes it the case that God's obligations are so different such that suddenly it's okay for him to passively watch millions of creatures suffer horrifically and die for no good moral reason, right? Now, if you want to say that there is a moral reason why God allows this, then that's different, right? But if you want to say that there's something about God such that he no longer has those obligations, well, I mean, that just seems untenable for pretty much everyone morally sensitive, right? Pretty much everyone wants to say that at least if moral truths aren't necessary truths, then they're at least necessarily supervenient truths, right? At least that's what the moral realist wants to say, right? There's going to be some sort of global supervenience thesis that they want to endorse there. So, I don't know. Like, I don't think that this approach is looking really swell to me. But like, I guess
that assumption defended is that if we say that God is not a human moral agent, then theism has no explanatory power because we can't explain why God does certain actions, right? But I think the way, at least the approach that me and Tim hold to, which is that God is a unique moral agent, I think that bypasses that problem because we're not saying that God has no obligations. We're not saying that God has no constraints on him. Just that his constraints are so unique to him, and that they're not going to be purely metaethical human constraints, basically. If that makes sense.
It's almost like the idea, like
yeah. I don't think once again, I don't think that we have to assume that it's the same constraints as humans. I just think that we can use intuition pumps to show that God's a relation to the situation isn't so different, such that like he would be justified in like allowing a lot of the stuff that he obviously does allow if he exists, right? And of course, what we're going to need is some further arguments that, or at least intuition, right? Seems to me that, when I reflect and look at like an infant burning to death, it seems to me that there's something wrong making about that, and there's nothing that I can see, as far as I can see, that's outweighingly right making about that. And of course, this is where a lot of the evidential problems of evil come in. And when we look at like animal pain, other facts, other features of evil, like the moral randomness of evil, the frequency and distribution of evil, particularly horrendous evils, right? Facts about pain and pleasure, flourishing and languishing, right? When we look at all these features of evil we see in the world, doesn't seem like it would be very surprising if it turns out that there's a morally perfect being such that all their obligations happen to align with permitting all this evil. That would be nothing short of like a cosmic lottery ticket to me. Like that would be just insanely improbable to me. Like even more probable than, at least like comparably improbable as all the fine tuning constants. Like that's how insane to me it seems. Of course, it's logically possible. I'm willing to grant that that's logically possible, but it just seems to me insanely improbable. Like when we look at all the features of evil, when we look at every instance of evil, like when we just look out into the world and see all this stuff, and all these considerations, such as Michael Tooley's approach, Paul Draper's approach, it just seems extraordinarily implausible that they're all justified. That God's obligations would just happen to align with permitting all these evils. That seems insanely unlikely to me.
The episode theist is just like, yeah, totally unique. Like we have no way of knowing like what he may like do or not do. Maybe like extreme forms of skepticism. And the other end, if people may say like, well, we totally know what God wouldn't do. You guys want to kind of like find like a middle ground? Is that kind of the path you're trying to go forward with?
Yeah, because on my video on the problem of evil, one of the first things I go over is this distinction. These two extreme camps, right? You have the skeptical theist, which says God, we can't know anything about why God allows for evil. But then you also have this dogmatic, what I call dogmatic theism, which is where we know everything about why God allows for evil, right? What I found is that the best approach, right, is going to be somewhere in the middle, right? It's going to be in between those two extremes. And what is that? Well, it just means that we can have some idea of why God allows for evil, right? We can have some sort of like, aesthetic and moral, what I call meta-normative constraints that sort of guide God's actions, right? So we can, theism in that sense has explained for power because it can sort of explain why we live in this type of world, right? Why God, allows for certain evils, but it's not saying that we can know everything, right? So in that case, then I think that the cool thing about this approach is that it allows theism to be a research project, which means we're able to learn more about why God allows for evil. So like I admit that right now, like I don't know every single reason why God allows for evil, right? That's a research project, right? We continually learn more about why God, does those certain things. And so yeah, I think what that allows us to do is sort of, I think it shows us that theism can sort of be its own research project, right? We can sort of understand, we can grow our knowledge in why God does certain things, and it can grow our knowledge in just, it can grow our knowledge in like the explanatory power of theism, right?
Yeah.
So that's how I view it. And so now, of course, I do want to sort of get into a little bit here what I think God's constraints are, right? Okay, yeah. So one of the constraints is going to be sort of aesthetic constraints, and one of the core principles behind that is what is called the defeat condition. When me and Tim were researching this, we first came across the defeat condition in in Abbott's book, Horrendous Evils and the Goodness of God. We also saw that, and then also Trent Dowdry's work on animal suffering. But the whole principle behind this let me see if I can find it. But
I haven't looked up I haven't really looked into his book yet. I actually have his book on one of my PDS folders. It's in one of my folders. I haven't been looking at it yet though. I definitely want to check it out because I heard it's one of the most state-of-the-art contemporary defenses of theodicy, at least theodicy of animal pain. So definitely would want to check that out, see what's up with that, because it seems interesting to me, because I know that Trent Doherty has some like really good papers and approaches to skeptical theism, and I know he even wrote the SEP page on skeptical theism. So that's definitely something I want to check out.
So the whole idea behind this principle is that God is authorized to allow evil as long as the evil is defeated within the total existence of whatever evil happens to a creature, right? And I think, let me see if I can find it real quick. So this whole, okay, here it is. So Adams and John Snyder define evil as this, or defeated evil as this. And evil is defeated when it is integrated as a constructive part of a valuable composable whole that not only outweighs the evil, but could not be as valuable as it is without that evil, right? So in that instance, the evil sort of remains in the subject, right? But it is defeated, right? And it becomes a sort of a greater composable whole, right? And I think this condition actually, it's sort of, I think what it does is it sort of shows that arguments for evil make this fundamental error, where they're gonna, a lot of them, I don't know if necessarily all the arguments for evil do this, but what I've seen is that like the vast majority, even Robert Bass's paper on inscrutable evils, he makes the same assumption as well, where it's like, well, God is constrained by the necessity condition, and on the necessity condition, God can only allow evils that are necessary for greater good, right? So there has to be this sort of necessary condition by which, okay, you can only bring about greater goods if that evil, without greater good, would not be possible without the evil, right?
Yeah.
The problem here is this assumes, this is going to assume human moral conditions on evil, right? It sort of has to ignore this defeat condition idea, right? And so what I think the defeat condition does is it sort of nullifies the argument, right? So what it does is basically, on that sort of view, even especially when we're talking about like,
I don't think I quite understand the defeat condition. Maybe I think I'll have to go back a little bit, because I don't think I quite understand that, but I don't know if even I agree with the what he calls the necessitation condition, because it seems to again have like these assumptions with like using like terms of axiology, um, that the only way to like justify gratuitous evil is if there's some greater good that entails it. Um, so I guess I don't know if I would even assume the necessitation condition. Um, uh, I mean, I guess a lot of the best problems of evil, well, certainly William Rose assumes something like that. But hold on, I'll go back. I kind of want to like hear what he said again.
Good, right? So that has to be this sort of necessary condition by which, okay, you can only bring about greater goods if, that evil. And I think this condition actually, it's sort of, I think what it does is it sort of shows that arguments for evil make this fundamental error where they're gonna, a lot of them, I don't know if necessarily all the arguments for evil do this, but what I've seen, as long as the evil is defeated within the total existence of whatever God. We also saw, well, that and then also Trent Dowdery's work on animal suffering. But the whole principle behind this, let me see if I can find it. But so the whole idea behind this principle is that God is authorized to allow evil as long as the evil is defeated within the total existence of whatever evil happens to a creature, right? And I think, let me see if I can find it real quick. So this whole, okay, here it is. So Adams and John Snyder define evil as this, or defeated evil as this. And evil is defeated when it is integrated as a constructive part of a valuable composable whole that not only outweighs the evil, but could not be as valuable as it is without that evil, right? So in that instance, the evil sort of remains in the subject.
One more time.
But it is defeated, right? And evil is defeated when it is integrated as a constructive part of a valuable composable whole that not only out valuable composable this, or defeated evil is this. And evil is defeated when it is integrated as a constructive part of a valuable composable whole that not only outweighs the evil, but could not be as valuable as it is without that evil, right?
So that's the defeat condition. Valuable composable whole. I guess I kind of understand that, but it's unclear exactly at what point that diverges from the necessitation condition. More valuable as a whole. It just seems to me to be something similar, at least, to saying that the greater good is entailed. I don't know. I'd have to think about that for a bit.
Right. So in that instance, the evil sort of remains in the subject, right? But it is defeated, right? And it becomes a sort of
it remains in the subject, but it's defeated.
A greater composable whole, right? And I think this condition actually, it's sort of, I think what it does is it sort of shows that arguments for evil make this fundamental error where they're gonna, a lot of them, I don't know if necessarily all the arguments for evil do this, but what I've seen is that like the vast majority, even Robert Fass's paper on inscrutable evils, he makes the same assumption as well, where it's like, well, God is constrained by the necessity condition, and on the necessity condition, God can only allow evils that are necessary for greater good, right? So it has to be this sort of necessary condition by which, okay, you can only bring about greater goods if
it has to, and the necessitation condition is important because it has to be entailing, otherwise, right? Because if I like go out and steal something, but then I realize that it was wrong, and then I compensate them like with $5 or whatever, how much I stole from them. Then obviously, right, like that doesn't make, when I first stole the item, that doesn't justify, like it was still a wrong action, all things considered, right? So it has to be an entailing relation, right? It has to entail the greater good, otherwise the good is not going to be justified, all things considered. It would just be like a compensatory good.
That evil, without greater good, would not be possible without the evil, right?
Yeah.
The problem here is this assumes, this is going to assume human moral conditions on evil, right? It sort of has to ignore this defeat condition idea, right? And so what I think the defeat condition does is it sort of nullifies the argument, right? So what it does is basically, on that sort of view, even especially when we're talking about like, best kinds of worlds and stuff like that, what I've seen a lot happen is like the best kind of worlds are going to be worlds where, the good would always sort of outweigh the evil, right? And that, the best world would be where there's just good, right?
Yeah.
But what this defeat condition does is it totally changes the game, because it's not about the balancing off, right? It's not that, you only have all good and no evil, but rather there's this defeat idea where the balancing off relation is sort of nullified when we understand that the evil can be sort of part of a larger composable whole of the goodness of the world, right? And so this sort of changes the game, because in that sense, then the best world is not going to be a world where you just have all good and no evil, but rather the best world is going to be a world where you have evil, but that evil is sort of part of a greater whole, so it's defeated in that sort of sense. If that makes sense.
Yeah, no, I'm with you.
So yeah, it's going to be basically, I think what he's saying is that the evil is justified, not in virtue of there being some better world in which the evil doesn't exist, but like like there being no better world in which the evil doesn't exist, right? But in virtue of the evil being just constituting some whole, some greater like composable whole, which includes the evil as one of its constituents. I think that's what he's getting at, right? So yeah, basically what I'd say is that like this doesn't really nullify the problem of evil at all. You can still run Michael Tooley's, you can still run Paul Draper's, right? Um, Again, it would be amazing if it turned out that God's obligations in this defeat condition, or like God's responsiveness to this, what's known as this defeat condition, were such that it just so happened to be the case that pain and pleasure happens to align with reproductive success, right? There's all these facts about flourishing, languishing among biological organisms, right? It would be amazing if it turns out that God's desires happen to align, or God's reasons at least, happen to align with all of that. It just seems to be like just a post hoc sort of bad explanation for these features, right? And then there's features related to like moral randomness, like a child getting cancer. On naturalism, it just seems like we have an explanation in terms of like the cancer metastasized to their brain, and that's it. Like that's what happened, right? Whereas, just seems like something that like insanely morally shocking. Um, so like it just seems like on theism, like we, at the next moment we would expect something um, to diverge, right? At least in some cases. Um, so the moral randomness of evil and the fact that they happen to people who are morally innocent seems to be something that counts against theism as well. And then there's like a lot of other features of evil when we subdivide them into particularly horrendous instances of evil, such as obviously Rose cases, flesh-eating parasites, and when we take into consideration inductive logic considerations, right? It doesn't seem like there's any reason being offered, right? Like, sure, this is a story you can tell, like this idea of there be of the evil playing a part or constituting some greater compossible whole, right? This is a story you can tell, and it's a logically possible story. I'll even like be happy to grant that, um, which explains the evil, right? It's a consistent set when you add it to theism. It explains the evil, right? It explains why there's evil in the world, right? But it's not clear that this is a good explanation, right? Like it seems to me that you can tell similar stories to make theism consistent with any number of state of affairs. So it just seems to me that it's just a bad explanation, not a very particularly virtuous explanation, and it just seems to me a priori at least seems to me that extremely unlikely that God's obligations as a unique moral agent and God's reasons and features he shares with the world such that he created the world exactly as it is right now. That includes all this horrific suffering, pain and pleasure, obviously other considerations. Um, that God's reasons just happen to align with all of this. Just seems completely incredible, right? It just seems completely unlikely. Um, Whereas on naturalism plus our background information, doesn't seem unlikely at all, right? Doesn't seem um, even a little bit unlikely. Um, so, yeah, in general, I'm not convinced that this response really does anything to the problem of evil. Maybe I'm just being a hard ass. Maybe I'm being stubborn. Maybe I have a stick up my butt. But I'm just not convinced.
And what this does is this sort of nullifies any argument. Well,
I actually had to think a bit for the defeat condition thing though, but because I actually haven't like read anything about that. I honestly, I really should read more on like theistic responses to the problem of evil. I think this defeat condition idea is interesting though. Like, um, I do think that this is a story you can tell, um, to make it the case that the theistic hypothesis is consistent, at least logically consistent with the evils we see in the world. Although I'm not even sure if I'd even grant that because when we take into considerations, God being the greatest possible good. But let's put those aside for now. Like I don't want to fight that battle right now. But yeah, I mean, I'm happy to grant that that this is one consideration that you can add to the theistic hypothesis. But it seems to me that it just lowers the intrinsic probability of theism so much because it just seems completely insane that moral perfection would align, that omnipotence and moral perfection would make it the case that God's desires and reasons align with everything we see in the world, right? All our moral intuitions about the evils we see in the world, all these features of the evils we see in the world, its distribution, its its frequency, its moral randomness, right? Facts about like pain and pleasure's relation to reproductive success, right? Facts about flourishing and languishing, right? just seems that these are like it'd be insane, like it'd be like highly almost ridiculous, like to think that God's reasons happen to align with all of this. Whereas on naturalism, when we think of these as uh, um, just random processes or random functions, um, and we already know how like things like natural selection work, how natural laws work. We have all this background information. If we add those to both hypotheses, and we see the datum, which is all this evil and all the features of these evils we see, it just seems like naturalism does a lot better than theism, or at least a hypothesis of indifference does a lot better than theism.
It nullifies any logical argument from evil, but it also, I think, nullifies any evidential argument from evil, because a lot of evidential arguments will sort of ignore this fact, and they'll sort of assume the what's called the necessity condition, right? And if God is not a human moral agent, then it's going to just nullify any sort of argument, right? So to the point where the probability, like the evidential force,
Yeah, I don't think that God not being a human moral agent nullifies anything, but let's
the evil has with the defeat condition is going to be zero, right?
Mhm.
Now, of course, there is one exception to this, which is if an atheist can show that there are evils that are
And I
unredeemable.
disagree that the problem of evil has no force with the defeat condition. I still think it just seems intuitive to me that even though even though the evils can serve as a function to be constitutive of some greater compossible whole, like they're part of the value of this greater compossible whole, it just seems to me that like there's still this intuition where it's like all these evils just happen to align with God's reason. It just seems like a bad explanation. It just seems like, I mean, you could tell a story such that a morally perfect being like God can be consistent with like pretty much all states of affairs. So, one, it just seems like the hypothesis starts out with like it just seems like it has like this insane low prior probability. Like it just I don't understand like. I can't like what I want to say is that I can't overstate how low the prior on theism is given this information, right? And well, not the prior, but the probability given our background information plus the datum. I don't want to overstate how insanely low the probability of theism would be if you just the idea that God's desires line up with all this. But B, there's also a theoretical cost here. It just makes theism just a horrible explanation, right? Because, I mean, anyone can stipulate anyone could tell a story that's consistent with their hypothesis that explains facts that seem prima facie inconsistent with their hypothesis, unless you have independent motivation for it, right? It doesn't seem like there's any independent motivation to think that this defeat condition would make it the case that God's desires align with all these features we see, right? So it just seems to make theism an untestable, explanatory, impotent hypothesis, which it already has a lot of theoretical disadvantages, such as like ontological parsimony, right? It loses on that compared to naturalism. I think Graham Oppie in a lot of his works shows that sufficiently. So on top of that, it just makes theism almost completely explanatorily impotent. It just completely, in my opinion at least, destroys theism as an explanatory hypothesis, such that arguments which try to show that features of consciousness and fine tuning are evidence for theism. Well, I mean, since you've basically kicked the divine psychology can off of left field, you've basically destroyed your chance of those arguments. You've pretty much destroyed theism as an explanatory hypothesis, because there's no state of affairs that's going to be inconsistent with some story you can tell about God's desires, right? Like you didn't give any independent motivation for thinking that God's desires happen to align with all these facts we see in the world. You basically see these facts in the world, and then you come up with this story. You add this defeat condition to the theistic hypothesis. And I'm not saying the defeat condition itself is improbable, but theism plus the defeat condition, plus all of God's desires and reasons happening to align with all these features we see, just seems to completely destroy theism as an explanatory hypothesis and lower its prior probability by a non-trivial degree. So it basically, at best, what you have here is a significant theoretical cost, not an escape of the problem of evil. Not a proof that the problem of evil has no evidential weight against your position. Rather, you've basically just lowered the probability of theism and destroyed the hypothesis.
Or undefeatable, then I would say that is evidence against theism, right? I would go so far as to say that is a falsification of theism, right? The problem is there's no examples of that at all. Like every example of evil that we come up with are defeatable in some sense, right? They're redeemable in some sense, right?
Yeah.
And you can look at this for any evil, like evolutionary evils, teleological evils, any sort of evils, even like the worst, even like horrendous evils, like every single one of those examples.
Okay, now he's claiming that they are defeatable. Well, I mean, I'd ask that. I just if this was a debate context, I'd ask what the argument for that is. But let's see what his point is here.
All you have to ask is this evil redeemable? Is this evil defeatable? And if it is, it's not going to have any evidential weight against theism, right?
Mhm.
So,
Yeah.
so yeah,
Yeah, I like this kind of approach of where we're looking at this idea of like, well, God is unique, so we can understand like we may not have like all the reasons given like evil like knowing it now, but knowing like the nature of God, like all evils can and would be redeemed. It's not just like, oh, he might or he may not, but they will be. Like even like the most intense like sufferings of like human beings or animals, whatnot. Like we know like God's a unique moral agent who can also is proof of good. Will redeem these things. I think that's super helpful. So yeah, that's a great point. I like that. Anything else you want to say before we go on to number 3?
Not too much, although there is one. I think there's one objection that I want to sort of address before we get to the next issue, which is, well, God can create a world where every evil is just necessary, right? Like why would God, if God has the ability to do this set of actions, and why would he do that, right? And my response to that is, well, you seem to be assuming that just because God can do it does not mean he's motivated to do it, right?
Yeah.
Right. So what's important here is that
See, this is what I'm talking about, right? If we can't if we can't predict what God's going to be motivated to do just by looking at some of the features in goods and evil, because it seems to me that when it comes to divine psychology, the only way to predict God's actions is in virtue of his moral perfection. Like what would you expect a divine agent to do, given they have these attributes, right? Because we don't have any further background information about God's beliefs and desires. So if you want to like argue that just because of this, it doesn't mean that God's going to be motivated to do that. Well, then how the hell are we supposed to reason about divine psychology at all, right? How are we supposed to have theism as this explanatory hypothesis at all, right? We theism is going to be completely impotent and just useless as an explanatory hypothesis if we don't know what beliefs and desires to posit of God. And plausibly, if God is morally perfect, there has to be like some way of predicting God's beliefs and desires, such that like there's some evils that would be evil states of affairs that would be inconsistent with some state of affairs that would be inconsistent with God's desires. So what state of affairs are they that the theistic hypothesis rules out, right? In a non-ad hoc way, right? What state, like if like I'd say the degree to which a hypothesis is testable is the degree to which it rules out some state of affairs that's inconsistent with the hypothesis. But if you're gonna want to like undermine any attempt to sort of reason about what God's motivations would be, then it just seems to really harm theism as an explanatory hypothesis.
that just because God has the ability to do something does not mean that he's not going to have some overriding motivation, right? What matters for theism, what matters for God is not his ability, but rather his motivation to do something, right? So if God has overriding motivations to, allow for defeatable evils, then he will do it, right? If God has overriding motivations to do that, if he has sort of like these metanormative motivations, these aesthetic motivations to pursue that, then that's all that really matters, right? Just because God has the ability to do something else does not mean he's going to, right? What matters is the motivations that God has for doing an action, right? So I just want to, answer that objection, but yeah.
Yeah, that's great. Thank you. So then the third thing we're looking at here is this problem of fine-tuned virtues. So let's dive into that a little bit, Kyle.
Yeah, so this one was a little bit tricky.
So yeah, that's 2 for 2. There are 2 responses about God's being a God's shared axiology and God being a moral agent. And the upshot is I find neither of them convincing, but hopefully this third response will be at least a bit more convincing for me.
Because I had to reread, I reread Trent Dowdry's work on this, I think like 3 times, at least that chapter. I think it was chapter, I forgot which chapter exactly it was. Let's see here. So chapter, chapter 7. That's okay, yeah. So chapter 7 was where he sort of presents this argument from, he doesn't necessarily call it fine-tuned virtues, but it's sort of a fine-tuned argument, right? Where this whole idea that in order to have certain virtues, you're going to have a world where there's this sort of narrow range of good and evil states of affairs, right? So the reason for that is because a logically necessary condition for the display of some of the highest virtues, right? You look at certain saints, you look at just generally speaking, like in order to have certain virtues, you're going to have to go through certain suffering, right? You're going to have to go through these trials in life, right? One good example is like the defeat of fear, right? In order to have courage, you need to overcome a fear. In order to feel compassion, you have to understand someone's pain. In order to forgive somebody, someone had to do a bad action against you, right? So these sort of things. I mean, there's plenty of examples of virtues, right? But my point here is that these virtues cannot exist without suffering, without evil, right?
Yeah.
Well, that's already a controversial claim. Like, fear. I mean, fear doesn't necessarily entail suffering. Like, you can imagine the fear of losing from a game of sports, right? And you can imagine building courage through engaging in athleticism, engaging in football, soccer, right? You could build courageous virtues out of because courage obviously entails fear, right? Fear itself, you might want to say fear itself is a bit of an evil, but it doesn't really seem to entail a substantial amount of suffering, right? Just imagine fear when playing, when engaging in football, right? Or even sympathy and kindness. Doesn't seem like the kindness that a mother shares for her infant is any less just in virtue of the infant's of responding to the infant's suffering, or the sympathy that people can share when reading fictional novels, and sympathizing with the I mean, you can say that that's a lesser sympathy, but even if you want to say that that's a lesser sympathy, um, doesn't seem to me um, that's like metaphysically necessary. At least it's no more likely that that's metaphysically necessary than it being um, not metaphysically necessary. I don't see any argument either way, right? It seems both of those possibilities at least have equal epistemic weight. So, um, and like more plausible is that it's not there's no metaphysical like necessity condition there. Like it doesn't seem to me that there is anything metaphysically necessary about God making it like it doesn't seem that there's anything metaphysically necessary, but the response of sympathy to fictional novels being less sympathetic or less great than the response of sympathy to suffering, right? It doesn't seem to me that that's metaphysically necessary, right? And if it is metaphysically necessary, well, I just ask for an argument for that, right? And there's actually another response in regards to virtues, right? Which is that prior to creation, God exemplifies every single like good making property to a maximal degree, better than humans do, right? All these virtues, presumably, God possesses them in a better way than humans do, right? So, just seems like that's a defeater for the claim that these virtues require evil, right? So there's 2 points to me here. There's the point of God prior to creation. He's priorly pure. Like there's no good missing from God, presumably. And if there is good missing from God, well, you just be saying that God's not the greatest conceivable being. How dare you? How dare you, right? That would be almost heretical on a lot of views, right? And things are only good to the extent they resemble God, presumably. Or if you don't want to take that approach, they're good to the extent where they resemble like the purpose that God created for them, or something such like, right? So there's no good missing from God, right? And so this idea that there's these virtues that entail evil, and that the world's better, all things considered, just in virtue of having all these virtues, right? It seems to me that given your own view, you actually have a defeater for that. And I'm sorry, I know I've been gassing a bit. I know I've been spurging out a bit. I actually do have high functioning autism, so you'll have to forgive me here. But like I'm trying my best to articulate myself and the responses to this video.
And the whole point of this is that you have to have a sort of limited range of evil, right? Because on naturalism, you compare with naturalism, there is no like constraint. There is no value sort of. I'm going to get more into this in my next objection, but there's no constraint on what naturalism can allow when it comes to evil, right? You can have a a world where everything's going good. You can have a world where everything's going bad, right? There's no constraint there. The only time where naturalism actually has an advantage is going to be when theism doesn't have an advantage. So basically, when theism makes a false prediction, right? We'll get more into that on the next problem. But this problem of fine-tuning virtues, I think what it shows is that naturalism makes no predictions about the fine-tuned range of virtues, right? So I don't even think naturalism predicts that there are going to be virtues at all, right?
Yeah.
And that's a huge problem because in order for there to be virtues, you need to have a fine-tuned range of good and evil suffering. But it doesn't seem to me like you could actually, at least on naturalism, you're not going to like expect this sort of thing to occur.
Yeah.
Right?
Okay. That's super great. I think one of the things, and I think it's overlap a little bit with your next, it's helpful for me like thinking about the problem of evil. One of the ways to really help me is thinking about like maybe like theism, like just grant for a second that like, well, theism really doesn't have an explanation for like why the state of affairs is this way rather than this way. Well, it seems like naturalism, right? Theism have the same exact problem. Like there's no reason given atheism that we have like this world versus the world of like maybe like 5 like hydrogen and floating around, or like protons and neutrons are sticking together, or like any other like state of affairs. So I think it's a super helpful thing when you're looking at the problem of evil is really think about like, well, given naturalism, would we expect a world like this? And it just seems very unlikely as well, even if you were going to say that, like theism is in the same boat. So
yeah.
So yeah, this could be fixed if you insist on like starting with naturalism, rather than something like a hypothesis of indifference, because that'd be another approach. Like given naturalism alone, yeah, we don't expect this world, but like if you do something like, which, and this is Paul Draper's approach, you include naturalism plus our background information, the relevant sort of background information, or theism versus our plus our background information, the same set of background information we add. So we basically take the priors of theism and naturalism, and then add our background information to both of them, and then we add the datum, which is going to be like these evils we see in the world and the features of these evils we see in the world. Well, naturalism better predicts them, I'd say, because again, naturalism, given our background information about natural selection, since we know that these other features of natural selection, like we know that our organisms evolved, and we know that they have these features such that naturalism selects out traits that are beneficial for survival and reproduction. It seems completely expected on naturalism plus our background information that reproductive success is going to have these connections with pain and pleasure. Pain and pleasure is going to have these connections with reproductive success. Sorry. Whereas on theism, I don't think that theism makes any such prediction. It would just have to be the case that God's desires happen to align with pain and pleasure, having reproductive success for biological organisms. And a similar argument can be run with flourishing and languishing. A similar argument can be run with particularly horrendous evils. I like Michael Tooley's inductive logic approach, and I think it successfully shows that it's extremely probable that there's at least some instance of gratuitous evil. There's a lot of approaches you can take here, and so yeah, I think this criticism of naturalism not predicting the evils we see or not predicting the world we see, I think is impotent and doesn't really do anything to address some of the best versions of the problem of evil. And on the other hand, this idea that that naturalism doesn't predict virtues, I guess I can like grant that. Like I can say that this is like some separate datum, which I'm willing to grant that here. Like I'm not sure if I in the ultimate scheme of things that I would grant it, but in this particular context, I'm willing to grant that here and say that virtues are something that are a piece of datum that that theism has an advantage over, right? There's something that's more expected on theism than naturalism, but I don't think it really does anything to the argument. Right? I still think that that the problem of evil works, right? It just means that there's this this other piece of data that we have to consider that favors theism. But like that doesn't show that the problem of evil doesn't work. Like, not at all, right? Like I don't think that any of these considerations so far have shown that.
Yeah, because one of the things that I sort of noticed is like even if this sort of world is unlikely on theism, well, how is it more likely on naturalism? Like
Exactly,
where is that going to play into there? And I think one of the issues I think a lot of people don't understand is even if it's like 1% probability that we're living in this happy universe on theism, as long as that's higher than on naturalism, like let's say if it's 0.5% on naturalism versus 1% on theism, well, theism's gonna have like double the advantage, right? Even
like, honestly, probably a lot worse for naturalists. There's a lot more than like 200 different universes that could have existed. So I think it's a lot worse for them.
Yeah. So this whole idea of fine-tuned virtues, I think that fine-tuned virtues are sort of that's actually evidence for theism, right? So in order to achieve the highest virtues, in order to display them and act upon them, you're gonna have to have this sort of world where there's a certain rate of suffering, right? Now again, it doesn't exactly predict, right? Theism doesn't exactly predict you're gonna have this.
I'm willing to grant that if you just consider the datum of virtues themselves, that's going to be something that favors theism. But I'd say that this falls into I'd say this falls at least dangerously, if close, if not just outright commits the what Draper calls the fallacy of understated evidence. Like sure, like if you just consider the datum of these virtues, then yeah, theism better predicts them, right? But if you also consider the fact that prior to creation, these virtues existed anyways on theism, on theistic personalism at least, God exhibited these virtues to a maximal degree, right? Or at least if you add the datum that if God didn't possess these virtues, oh, well then the greatest possible good existed without these virtues. So how are these virtues good making, right? So you have like this sort of like dilemma here. Either God possessed these virtues prior to creation or he didn't. If he didn't, then well, the greatest possible good existed without these virtues, right? The most maximally great being existed sans any of these virtues, which means that which means that on your own view, it's hard to see how these virtues would be valuable at all in the first place, right? Whereas if God did have these virtues sans creation, well, then these virtues don't entail evil, which means that your point doesn't go through, right? So if you add that to your background information, suddenly it doesn't look so good for your hypothesis. And also basically like there's also like other features of evil which we would add to the hypothesis in which naturalism does better than theism as well. I would say that like basically this consideration here doesn't really do anything. At best, it's another piece of data which we have to add to our hypothesis construction, which favors theism, but it doesn't show that the problem of evil fails, and that when all the data is taken into consideration, you find that facts about good and evil in the world favor naturalism over theism. So this third response to the problem of evil, I don't think it's convincing. We're three for four so far, and I don't think any of these responses to the problem of evil have worked so far.
This amount of suffering, right? But there is still going to be a range there, right, when it comes to this. And I think the issue there is on naturalism, you don't expect any of this, right? Whereas on theism, I think you do. I think you do expect virtues to play out, right? I think that. So yeah, but I hope that makes sense.
Yeah, I think that's great. I think it's going to kind of get into this fourth and final problem that we're going to talk about today, which is the problem of value mapping. And yeah.
So this is actually So this final problem I think is actually probably the most consequential for the problem of evil. I think that not only does this problem sort of nullify, so not only does it, I think, refute the problem totally, but I think it actually reverses it, right? I think it's very simple, to point out here. There's a few considerations. So I call this the problem of value mapping at the Odyssey, right? So for theism, there's a good mapping from God's nature to a state of affairs, right? So you have God is all good, right? So then God would sort of actualize or allow for a good state of affairs to occur, right? And this is interesting because what this concludes is that any good state of affairs would be evidence for theism, right? You could sort of expect, okay, if God is all good and there's a good state of affairs, well, why does the state of affairs occur? Well, because God is all good, right? You can sort of link that there. You can sort of predict that on the hypothesis, right? But for naturalism, you don't have that, right? So on naturalism, you don't have a good mapping from an indifferent universe, right, to a state of affairs, right, or at least a good state of affairs, right? And the reason for this is because there's no value mechanism to sort of, tell you, why would you expect this state of affairs versus another state of affairs, right? And so this leads to the conclusion, of course, that there is no set of good or bad states of affairs that could be evidence of naturalism, right? So in order for naturalism to actually have the advantage, right, and this is something that Paul Draper sort of does, where basically it has to rely on theism making false predictions. So like even if naturalism may not exactly predict the date of evil, right, even if it doesn't exactly predict that there's going to be like this sort of high rate of suffering, the argument is that theism predicts the opposite, right? So theism would predict, one example is like, okay, well, theism's going to predict a perfect world. Theism's going to predict that there's only good state of affairs. Theism's going to, I guess you could say like basically theism predicts a bed of roses, right? And so the argument is that, well, because theism makes a false prediction, right, then at least on naturalism you sort of have the advantage, right? Because at least there it's sort of epistemically friendly, or at least evil is sort of epistemically friendly to naturalism, right?
So he's basically saying that naturalism doesn't make any predictions about values. I think that's what he's saying. I'll have to actually listen to him some more, though.
It's more epistemically friendly. However, this leads to a huge problem, right? So the problem is that the moment that theism uses a theodicy to explain, why we have a certain distribution of good and evil, naturalism is actually at a disadvantage, right? Because it doesn't have any sort of value mechanism, it doesn't have what I call value mapping in order to explain any sort of evil. Whereas what theism does is it allows for a sort of groundwork for such a mapping to be possible. What does this mean? Well, it means that given a sort of theodicy, right, theism imposes some limitations on the upper
Okay, let me just let him finish, actually.
and lower bounds of the distribution of good and evil, right? So what theism does, it actually allows you to at least have some bare minimum explanatory account of why there is good and evil in the first place, why there is a set of good and evil in the first place. But naturalism doesn't do any of that, right? So naturalism does not give you.
Well, I mean, naturalism doesn't give you any of that. So first of all, this just seems to like beg the question against like moral naturalism, where like naturalism is just going to be, where values are just going to be identified with some set of natural properties, or say synthetically identical to some set of natural properties, or like what realists want to say, are empirically discoverable and supervene on a set of natural properties. So like I'd say that, like, first of all, like if you want to say that it's not expected, then if you want to say that naturalism doesn't have any of these anything here, then I would say that doesn't really do anything to the idea where more moral values and moral like reasons are going to be just identical to some sort of natural property. But of course, I don't really find moral naturalism convincing myself, so we can just forego that. Hold on, let me actually like go back and like see what he said again.
Explanatory account of why there is good and evil in the first place, why there is a set of good and evil in the first place. But
so I would say, okay, so why is there good and evil in the first place? Well, the moral naturalist is going to want to say that the evil, like good, like they're going to give some naturalistic account, some causal naturalistic account of evil is such and such homeostatic cluster of natural properties, and we can trace back its naturalistic history to blah 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 blah. And they want to say that this is the kind of thing that's empirically verifiable and discussable, right? And we do know the source of pain and the source of blah 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 blah, like whatever naturalistic account you want to do, right? Or if you're like an Aristotelian neo-Aristotelian naturalist, you have some other account of like good fixing. I don't know. There's like multiple ways to explain on naturalism, but either way, like it seems to me that what we'd expect given naturalism, and in fact, I think that this is exactly what we expect on naturalism, because Draper originally used the hypothesis of indifference instead of naturalism, is we would expect sort of just a random distribution, right? Like all things considered, right? We know that natural laws are indifferent to human suffering, right? We know that natural, like the biological mechanisms that are conducive to organs is predictably it's going to be is going to be about reproductive success and survival, right? And we know that natural laws themselves, like when a tornado hits a town, right? That's just how whatever like naturalistic mechanisms, like the hot air hitting the cold air. I don't know how tornadoes work, but like that's just naturalistic mechanisms at play, right? Like the tornado doesn't care about humans, right? So what we'd expect is just a sort of like indifferent or some sort of like random distribution of suffering. Seems to me that's what we'd expect on naturalism.
Doesn't do any of that, right? So naturalism does not give you any idea of why there's evil and suffering in the world, right?
Yeah.
The only time that naturalism has advantage, again, the only time that has advantage is if you say, well, theism just predicts, a bed of roses, right, or something. But of course, as a theist, I would disagree with that, given the fact that I think that God is a unique moral agent, that God would sort of allow for defeatable evils and stuff like that. And I think that at least the theodicy that I'm still working on it, but at least I have most of it out, which is basically what I call the evolving worlds theodicy. I did a video on it a while back. And basically the idea is that God sort of is going to create an evolving world, right? And I don't know if you want to get into that or not, if you want to get into my theodicy or not, but yeah, I do provide a sort of theodicy that sort of accounts, right, for the distribution.
And another thing to say about theodicies is that well, like there's actually a couple things to say about theodicies here. Is one is that pretty much all theodicies are going to lead to what's called extended theism. You basically take theism plus this hypothesis about God's desires, or this hypothesis about the evil in the world. And I'd say that, like, if you're just going to add that to theism, and give no independent justification for why it follows from theism or is entailed by the hypothesis of theism, which I don't think I've pretty much like almost never encountered a theodicy which gives convincing independent justification for such a thing. It seems like it's more of like a top-down reasoning approach. Like, we see this evil in the world and we create this theodicy to explain it, right? Unless you give independent justification for it, then it just seems like you're just like reducing the prior probability of theism by adding this just sort of like tacking this theodicy on to the hypothesis, right? So that's one point to make. And another is that pretty much all these theodicies, I'd say like basically all of them, just really do violence to our moral intuitions. And Stephen Meissen even has a good paper on this. They pretty much undermine ordinary morality, right? Like, take the free will defense. Intuitively, we don't think that like if I were to like sit by and watch an infant be raped because like I didn't want to like interfere in the perpetrator's free will. I mean, like, as a society collectively, we would all think that that's horrifically immoral. Like, it was just absolutely disgusting of me to sit by as a bystander and just watch an infant be raped. And even our actions in society sort of undermine this free will defense, right? Like, why do we put people in prison, right? It's precisely because we don't think that people's choices are worth the cost of the horrific evil we see. Like, our own actions sort of undermine this appeal to free will as a sort of moral justification for allowing evil, right? So there's a sort of asymmetry here with these theodicies in terms of like how we act versus how versus like the kind of justifications we give God, right? And I know like one of his earlier his earlier issues was God as a unique moral agent, but again, like, in virtue of like what is God a moral agent? Because intuitively, when we apply the properties of God to humanity, right? When we apply omnipotence to humans, when we apply omniscience to humans, intuitively, it doesn't seem like those are going to be like a morally relevant difference such that it justifies his actions, right? The human's actions, right? Like, we wouldn't say a human who's omnipotent, who sits by and watches a toddler be tortured. We wouldn't say that suddenly they're justified in virtue of being omnipotent. The same would be said about omniscience. The same would be said about, you know, infinite power, like infinite duration in time, right? It doesn't seem, or aseity, or like necessary existence. It doesn't seem like, I don't know, that there's any feature of God that should make us expect these obligations to be different. So it just seems like obviously that's a problem. Also, the other problems I laid out with this approach as well. So overall, I'm not really convinced.
Fusion of good and evil states,
Mhm.
right?
Yeah, maybe save the theodicy for another day. So we can
Yeah,
explore
that's fine.
major problems. Maybe we can even do another conversation because there's a lot of fun.
Yeah.
So we talked about these four big things, and one thing I just want to like reaffirm for people listening and viewing is like this showing like this big problem with like naturalism and explaining evil. Like, say that like you look at like a specific evil and you're like, well, there's like a 1 in a million chance that like theism could explain this evil. Well, you think about naturalism. Well, naturalism is actually better than 1 in a million. If I think about the way of like possible worlds, it seems like there's a lot more than a million possible ways these things could have gone given naturalism. If that's
Right.
the case, theism still is a better explanation of this, even if it's like a really poor one in your view.
Yeah.
It's one of the big problems for naturalism that we've been emphasizing is that what really does naturalism better predict than theism? Because it's really hard to see. Yeah, just hard to see.
Yeah, because I think that a lot of the times when these debates sort of, especially with theodicy, right? So with the theodicy, you know, the explanation for why they're evil on naturalism is like, well, the universe is indifferent, right? But then it's like, okay, well, how would an indifferent universe get you like any sort of state of affairs where there's, you know, good or bad states of affairs, right? But what I meant to say is like, okay, one example is like, well, one explanation of evil on naturalism is like, well, you know, the universe is indifferent, okay, that's fine, right? That's an explanation. But the moment that, you know, theism sort of imposes the limitations of the evil, like, so one example is the defeat condition, right? So if God can allow evils to be defeated, right, then that's going to automatically provide a better account than naturalism, right? Or God allows evil so that we can grow virtue. Okay, well, that's going to also provide a better account than naturalism, right? It's not all clear to me why naturalism actually explains evil better than theism, at least given a theodicy like that. So, again, I don't want to get too much into theodicy, but I just want to point out here that you do have this problem of value mapping. So you do have this issue of, you know, you get to allows evil so that we can grow virtue. Okay, well that's going to also provide a better account beyond naturalism, right? It's not all clear to me why naturalism actually explains evil better than theism, at least given a theodicy like that. So again, I don't want to get too much into theodicy, but I just want to point out here that
Well, I think for the reasons outlined, I think it's very easy to show that naturalism better explains theism, and that such a theodicy doesn't succeed at all.
you do have this problem of value mapping. So you do have this issue of, you get to from God to a good state of affairs, but on naturalism you don't get that, right? So there's going to be some tension in the probability space.
Yeah. Well, thanks so much for coming on, Kyle. Is there anything else you want to say with regards to like the problem of evil and what you've been laying out here before we wrap up today?
Yeah. So one of the things I mentioned in the beginning was my conclusion about the problem of evil not being a problem for theism, right? And as a theist, right? So as a theist now, I was hesitant to accept that conclusion, and I had to be honest. And I'm not trying to like be like, oh yeah, you're just being super biased. You're just trying to like support your prior position. But I had to change my position, especially in relation to like how God actually does his actions, right? So I had to like rethink my view of theism a lot and like why God does certain actions over others, right? And it took a while for me to sort of get to grasp that concept, but yeah, it was a journey, and even right now I'm still sort of, even though I'm not really focusing on probably evil too much, I still read it sometimes. Especially like one example, just briefly, I was rereading Gregory Dawes' book on theism and explanation, and I don't agree with him on a lot of stuff, but I do agree that at least if you're going with the whole idea that God is a human moral agent, I think you're gonna have a lot of problems there, right? And so one of the things that he goes over is that God he sort of tries to show that theism. Well, I think what he tries to show is that theism has low explanatory power, right? And I think the way that he does this is that he's going to assume, well, God wants to minimize suffering. Like he just says that outright. Like I can't remember exactly what page he says that on, but he just says it. Well, God's just going to minimize suffering, right? So like from the very beginning, like okay, well if you're going to say, well, God just must minimize suffering, and if I don't agree with that as a theist, then any sort of argument that you come up with about why theism has low explanatory power is not going to work.
So I think I actually have read Gregory Dawes' book, Theism and Explanation. It's one of my favorite philosophy of religion books of all time. I actually think it's like an amazing book. So highly recommend it. So yes. So basically, I think that Christian Ideal, Kyle here, I think he's misunderstanding Dawes' point here. So what Dawes is saying is that in order for like he basically in the first part of the book he sort of shoots down a lot of criticisms of theism being not a good in principle explanation, and in principle means that there's no way that in principle theism could be a good explanation for the facts we see in the world, right? It's just not possible. Theistic explanations just have this sort of inherent defect such that they couldn't even in principle be a good explanation. And Dawes spends the first few chapters shooting that down, and basically Dawes comes to the conclusion eventually, in light of all the criticisms of the previous chapters by people like Sober. I can't remember exactly who else, but like I know Elliot Sober is one of the names that were mentioned. Basically, the conclusion he comes to is that the only way for theism to be a good in-principle explanation, and there is a way for theism to be a good in-principle explanation for the features we see in the world, is if we use the rationality principle, which is the idea that we would expect agents, all things considered, to maximize their desires to act on reasons such that like they would like maximize their needs. So that their desires, like take for example, a person named Angie, who's sitting in a chair, and she walks up to the window and closes the window. So basically, what we posit is, like, if we want a successful agential explanation, is we posit specific desires of Angie. Like, she sees the window, there's cold air coming in, she doesn't want to be cold, so she closes the window, so that the cold air doesn't, make her cold anymore, right? So, and she's basically responding to the reasons she has, and given the desire she has, she's acting rationally in accordance with her desires, and that's what's going to be a necessary condition for an agential explanation. So the idea is, given this theistic hypothesis, how do we use because the theistic hypothesis is a sort of agential hypothesis, right? Because it's going to be a hypothesis that tries to make predictions on what like God would do, like given like his certain, basically like what God's reasons are, like what God will do, right? So how do we use the rationality principle to make theism make predictions, right? To make it a good explanation for facts we see in the world. And what Gregory Dawes suggests is that we put on what's called an optimality condition on theism, which is that we would expect, given God's moral goodness, given his moral perfection, we would expect, all things considered, that God would try to maximize goodness or minimize suffering, right? And he's basically saying that, like, given that moral perfection is the only like information we have about God, this is the only prior access we have to understand God's desires. This is the only way that there can even be in principle explanation of given a theistic hypothesis, right? We have to impose these optimality constraints on God's desires, right? Otherwise, theism doesn't make any predictions at all. Like we can imagine, we wouldn't have any clue what desires to posit of God, right? Like God's existence, for all we know, would be consistent with like fucking a world made of cheese, right? Or a world with I don't know, like a hellish world where like there's nothing but infants tortured like for eternity, right? God, there's no state of affairs that could possibly be inconsistent with just theism if we don't have any specific desires we have prior to observing the data, what we'd expect theism to predict, right? So basically, like what he argues is that the only way to given theism is to impose this optimality condition, and he's saying, oh yeah, well I don't accept this optimality condition. All right, well that's fine, but like you're just pretty much just ruining theism as an explanatory hypothesis. Then Dawes would just say that, okay, well then, given your brand of theism, then you wouldn't even have an in principle explanation. Like God couldn't even be an in principle explanation for the features we see in the world now in this case. So that's what Dawes' point is here, and I think it's sort of I don't know, like I don't know if he like skimmed the book, but in any case, it seems to me that his point his point didn't like really hit with him. It seems to me, at least.
Right. So in my mind, it sort of changed the way that I saw a lot of these atheological arguments, right, and a lot of atheist literature on this, because once you have the defeat condition in your mind, once you have that, and once you have the idea that God is a unique moral agent and all this stuff, then it's sort of like you can sort of filter out a lot of the arguments that you see in the atheist on the atheist side, right? So whenever I read any argument from evil paper now, I just check, okay, what axiological assumptions are they using, right? And most of the time, like it's going to be either the necessity condition, or it's going to be another condition, which is the minimized suffering condition, which is what Gregory Dowes did. And I'm just like, well, if you're using assumptions I don't agree with, then why should I take your argument into consideration, right? So yeah.
Yeah, it's been super helpful. It's definitely something I need to re-listen to. So I haven't studied the depth of the problem evil as well as you have. But I hope people listening that it kind of helps you like explore and think about these things, because really all these arguments are a lot more complex than often turn out to be, especially the problem evil. So yeah, thanks Kyle for helping and clarifying things and shedding light on things.
One last thing before we close off, there are 4 books that I would recommend every theist read. So the first one, of course, is going to be the one by Marilyn McAdams, right? This really helped me a lot in understanding these concepts. Then, of course, Richard Swinburne, I think it does pretty well on natural evil. And then the 2 biggest ones are going to be John Hick, right? He comes up with the Soul Building Theodicy, and then probably the best one, in my opinion, is going to be the one by Trent Dowdery. This is like, honestly, I don't know any other better book on the problem evil than this one. So at least on the theistic side, I would recommend that stuff. So yeah.
Well, right on, Kyle. Thank you so much for coming on today. Your channel, Christian Idealism, is just added in the description. And yeah, thank you so much for coming on. Hope you enjoyed the discussion. I did a lot. And thank you to everyone who tunes in and listens. Super grateful for you and your support. If you value the show, become a patron at patreon.com/Christian Apologetics. But that's it. We'll see you next time. Thank you so much. And
oh, sorry. Yeah, so that's his 4 responses to the problem of evil. Those are his criticisms of the problem of evil. Overall, I don't think that any of these considerations are ultimately convincing, and I think the problem of evil can still stand strong as a powerful atheological argument. Anyways, that's pretty much all I have to say in response to this video. So I'm going to be ending now. Peace.